The plasma rounds screamed overhead, scorching the crystalline walls of the outpost into molten slag. Grace pressed herself against the barricade, her forearms trembling with exhaustion. Her pale violet skin had turned almost gray, and the bioluminescent patterns that normally danced across her features had dimmed to barely visible flickers. The Vakroth swarm was relentless, their chittering war cries echoing through the canyon like the laughter of death itself. She had been fighting for 17 hours. Grace's species, the Litharii, were known across the galaxy as scholars and diplomats, not warriors. Their bodies were elegant but fragile, designed for art and philosophy rather than combat. Yet here she was, the last survivor of Outpost Theta 9, clutching a rifle that felt heavier with each passing moment. Her primary arm steadied the weapon while her secondary arms fumbled with a nearly depleted power cell. "Please," she whispered to no one, her voice barely audible over the sound of explosions. "Please let the distress signal have reached someone." The Vakroth had attacked without warning, their invasion fleet descending upon the research station like locusts. Grace had watched her colleagues fall one by one, their screams still haunting the edges of her consciousness. She had fought not because she was brave, but because there was no other choice. Every minute she held this position was another minute that the station's data could be transmitted to the Galactic Council. Evidence of the Vakroth's war crimes, proof that would rally the civilized species against this threat. But her strength was failing. Another wave crested the ridge. Dozens of Vakroth warriors, their armored carapaces gleaming in the light of the system's twin suns. Grace raised her rifle with shaking arms and fired. One fell, then another. But there were so many. Her weapon clicked empty. Grace slumped against the barricade, tears streaming down her face. This was how it ended. She had fought bravely. But bravery alone couldn't overcome mathematics. She was one and they were legion. Then she heard it, a sound like thunder rolling across the battlefield. Not weapons fire, something else. Something that made the ground tremble beneath her. The Vakroth hesitated, their advance faltering. They heard it too. From the opposite ridge, a figure appeared. He was tall, impossibly tall compared to Grace's delicate frame. He wore armor that looked cobbled together from a dozen different sources. Scavenged plates, reinforced mesh, and what appeared to be repurposed mining equipment. In his hands he carried weapons that Grace recognized as human-made, brutal, inelegant things that spoke of a species that had learned warfare in the harshest crucible imaginable. The human descended the ridge at a dead run, and as he ran, he roared. It was a sound Grace had only read about in xenological texts. Humans, it was said, possessed a peculiar ability to channel their emotions into physical manifestations of will. They called it battle fury or adrenaline rush. To Grace, it sounded like hope-given voice. The human, Ezra, she would later learn his name, crashed into the Vakroth line like a meteor. His assault rifle barked in controlled bursts, each round finding its mark with precision that belied the chaos around him. When the rifle ran dry, he didn't retreat. Instead, he drew a blade that looked more like a piece of industrial machinery than a weapon and threw himself into close combat. Grace watched in stunned disbelief as Ezra fought with a ferocity that seemed to violate every law of biology she understood. The Vakroth were individually stronger, their claws capable of rending steel, but Ezra was faster, more adaptable, and possessed a kind of tactical intelligence that turned the battlefield into his personal chessboard. He used the terrain, the wreckage, even the bodies of fallen enemies as tools. When a Vakroth warrior lunged at him, he dodged left and used the creature's momentum to send it tumbling over the cliff edge. When 3 more surrounded him, he triggered an explosive charge that he'd somehow planted during his advance, scattering them like toys. But what struck Grace most was that he was laughing, not the cruel laughter of a sadist, but the wild, exhilarated laughter of someone who had found their purpose. Humans, Grace remembered from her studies, were persistence hunters. They were the species that chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They were the species that looked at an apex predator and asked, "But can I tame it?" They were the species that simply refused to stop. Ezra fought his way across the battlefield until he reached Grace's position. He vaulted over the barricade, his armor scarred and smoking, and dropped a heavy pack beside her. "You look like hell," he said in perfect galactic standard, though his accent was thick with earth tones. "Name's Ezra. Ezra Hollis, Terran Defense Corps, retired." Grace stared at him, her translator implant struggling to keep up with both his words and her own shock. I thought I was alone." "You were," Ezra said, already reloading his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Picked up your distress signal about 3 hours ago. Took me a while to get here." He glanced at the Vakroth forces regrouping in the distance. "Looks like you've been doing one hell of a job holding them off." "I was out of ammunition," Grace said weakly. "I was about to—" "But you didn't," Ezra interrupted, his eyes meeting hers. They were brown, warm despite the coldness of the situation. "You fought bravely. That's what matters. But here's the thing, Grace. Yeah, I read your ID tag. You're not alone anymore." He pulled several power cells from his pack and pressed them into her secondary hands. "Rest for 60 seconds. Catch your breath. Then we're going to show these bug-eyed bastards why humans and Letheri make a good team." Grace felt something kindle in her chest. Not just hope, but something stronger. Determination. She had been fighting alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. Ezra positioned himself at the barricade, his rifle already tracking targets. "You know what humanity learned during our first century in space?" he asked conversationally, as if they weren't surrounded by enemies. "We learned that we're not the strongest species. We're not the smartest or the fastest or the most advanced." He fired 3 times in rapid succession. 3 Vakroth fell. "But we are the most stubborn, and we take care of our allies." He glanced back at her with a grin that was somehow both terrifying and reassuring. "So rest up, Grace, because in about 30 seconds we're going to counterattack. And I promise you, those Vakroth have never faced anything like a human who's decided that someone is worth protecting." Grace loaded a fresh power cell into her rifle. Her hands were no longer shaking. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin began to glow again, brighter than before. She moved to the barricade beside Ezra, her weapon raised. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ezra's grin widened. "Save the thanks for when we're drinking victory cocktails on a beach somewhere. Right now we've got work to do." The Vakroth charged again, but this time they weren't facing an exhausted, desperate Letheri scientist alone. They were facing that scientist alongside a human warrior who had crossed a battlefield specifically to ensure she wouldn't have to fight alone. And across the galaxy, that would make all the difference. When the Galactic Council later reviewed the battle data from Outpost Theta 9, they would struggle to understand how 2 individuals, 1 diplomat and 1 soldier, had held off an entire Vakroth assault battalion. The tactical analysts would write papers. The military strategists would create new doctrine, but Grace and Ezra would simply look at each other and smile, knowing the truth. Sometimes bravery isn't about fighting alone. Sometimes it's about finding someone who refuses to let you face the darkness by yourself. That is the human way.